Just play Kaiser levels of Mario Maker, it's way better. Fine, I'll talk about Lost Levels, the Mario game we never got until like 8 years later. So Super Mario Bros. Was a massive hit, and in other words, bears still shit in the woods. And it was the massive hit that gaming needed in order to not fade into irrelevancy like Bakugan, flossing, and the Google Stadia. So naturally, people wanted more Mario, and Nintendo wanted to expand on the floppy disks, so they made the Famicom Disk System, and a Mario game to go along with it. That game was Super Mario Bros. 2. The initial plan was to send it stateside and later Euroside, but they decided not to. The reason being, the game was much too hard. Well, that and it was far too similar to the first game in graphics and sound. We eventually did get the real sequel to Super Mario Bros. In the 1993 compilation Super Mario All-Stars, which is the version we'll be looking at, since not only does it have updated graphics and sound, that's easier on the eyes and ears, but a number of things were changed to make the game just a tad easier. More on that later. One thing I see a lot of people get wrong is some calling every part of the Famicom the Famicom Disk System, when that was only the add-on that allowed players to use floppy disks and add a few extra sound channels, namely for games like Zelda 1 and Metroid. Fun fact, the Famicom Disk System ended up selling 4.4 million units in its time, despite only being released in Japan. By weight of comparison, the Sega CD, which was not only released worldwide, but for a much more powerful system, the Sega Genesis, only sold 2.24 million, just barely over half of what the Famicom Disk System sold. Remember that when we eventually get to Sonic CD. So I guess Nintendo realized nobody was playing Super Mario Bros. Multiplayer, so they just decided to gut two-player mode entirely, replacing two-player mode with a Luigi game, where Luigi jumps higher, but he slips and slides like a greased-up marble in an ice skating rink covered in snot, which will go on to be his defining traits in the future installments. Personally, I prefer playing as Luigi, as well, yes, he is slippery. His high jump allows for him to get to areas much easier than his brother can. In terms of new enemies, we aren't really seeing any, just some variations of old enemies, and by that, I mean red piranha plants that are faster and only stop popping out of pipes when you're on top of the pipes, not just the sides anymore, and hammer brothers that sometimes don't stop moving towards you. Granted, they did that before, but you had to wait a while before they would get impatient and start chasing you. However, if you want to talk about new obstacles, let's start with the most famous of them all, the poisonous mushroom, which would give Mario fans worldwide PTSD for years to come. There are also a lot more maze castles, one where you can only progress as small Mario, green springs that would launch you so high that you wouldn't be able to see where you were until it's too late, and what has to be the most infuriating obstacle of the bunch, wind. The wind will either make you overshoot your jumps or undershoot them because you think the wind will carry you the distance that you need, whatever's more inconvenient at the time. Oh, and I really hope you love either bottomless pits or long stretches of nothing, the occasional Koopa Troopa, Buzzy Beetle, or the Confederacy, I mean Goombas. Because I counted numerous occasions where the only thing I had to do was either just run right and jump over bad guys, which, while brain dead, I am not about to complain about, or pray the wonky jumping mechanics that wouldn't be refined until much later would let me land on something safely in order to not lose my very rare power-up, which, yes, the power-ups are in fact extremely rare. And the further along you get, the less likely you are of getting a mushroom or a fire flower, and more likely to get a poison mushroom. Oh, and sometimes the level just gives up. This is another reason why I don't particularly like this game. There are several sections where the game will just unexpectedly come to a screeching halt to make you solve some arbitrary puzzle just to progress. Usually that involves just trying to find invisible blocks in places such a way so that when you do find the solution to the puzzle, you cannot possibly get enough momentum to jump on them unless you cheat. On top of that, as I mentioned, there are several instances of the game where obstacles are unavoidable, so even if you manage to scrape by with the rare fire flower, the game will just tell you, fuck you gotta lower your defenses just to make the enemy happy. Kinda like whenever you stand up against your bullies or tormentors in high school and your authority figures just tell you to ignore them, deal with it, be the bigger person, but I'm sorry, enough trauma dumping. There are also the Lost levels the American version was named after. These refer to Worlds 9, A, B, C, and D. In order to access World 9, you had to beat the entire game without using warps, including the trick one in World 3 that sends you all the way back to World 1. In the Famicom version, this game would take away all of your lives once you reach World 9 and leave you with 1 to beat World 9 with. I can't show you World 9 because I accidentally used a warp, but in the All-Star version, it doesn't take away your lives. And if you thought that was bad, in the original Famicom version, in order to access Worlds A, B, C, and D, you had to beat this game 8 fucking times. Once again, in the All-Star version, that's omitted. Instead, you just beat World 8, and bam, World A. And these levels are just more of the same bullshit that you were going through in Worlds 1 through 8. I know I shouldn't be complaining too much, but for the secret stages, these levels just suck. Especially when you realize most of them are just altered versions of old levels, unlike Worlds 1 through 8, which are all original and never reused. Something I forgot to mention in my first Mario game review is that many of the levels are just reskins of older levels to save space on the NES cartridge. Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels was designed for those who mastered the first Mario game and wanted a bit more challenge, and I can definitely see where you're coming from. The game does come off as a little too easy at times, but don't you think they went just a little overboard? Hell, according to sources, even Mr. Miyamoto was allegedly depressed when making this game. This game wasn't made available in the States because Nintendo feared fans would feel betrayed and hate Mario after he just saved the gaming industry. Despite this, the game was too hard for its own good and doesn't have a lot going for it beyond that. This feels like a ROM hack and not a good one. So if you want to play a super hard Mario game that for some reason you have a vendetta against ROM hacks, just refer to the statement I made at the beginning of this video. God bless.